Das erste Licht des Tages war ein blasses, pearlmattfarbenes Grau, das sich langsam durch die spitzen Vorhänge am Fenster schott und sanfte Schatten auf die gepolsterte Sitzbank warf. Ich erwachse nicht mit einem Ruck, sondern tauchte langsam auf, wie aus einem tiefen, stillen Teich. Die Stille war eine greifbare Substanz, die das Haus erfüllte, dick und beruhigend. Unter der leiten Baumwolldecke, deren kariertes Muster ich mit geschlossenen Augen nachzeichnen konnte, spürte ich den kühlen, glatten Satin der Bettränder. Der Geruch von frisch gebrühtem Kaffee kroch bereits die Treppe hinauf. Ein reicher, erdiger Duft, der von der perkolierten Maschine in der Küche unten ausgesandt wurde. Es war ein Geräusch, das noch nicht zu hören war, nur diese Verheißung, die in der Luft hing. Ich schwang meine Beine über die Bettkante und meine Füße fanden den flauschigen Wollteppich. Das Hauskleid aus weichen, gewaschenem Baumwoll, Flanell lag über dem Stuhl und ich schlüpfte hinein, spürte den vertrauten Komfort der weiten Arme und des gegürteten Teilenbunds. Draußen hinter dem Glas lag Maple Street in vollkommener Ruhe. Die Wege waren leer, die makellosen Rasenflächen glitzerten vom nächtlichen Tau und die Reihen identischer Ranchhäuser schienen noch zu schlummern, ihre großen Bildfenster dunkle Augen in der Dämmerung. Bald würden die Kinder erwachen, ihre Stimmen den Frieden durchbrechen, und die Männer würden mit ihren Aktentäschchen zur Arbeit eilen. Aber in diesem Augenblick gehörte die Welt nur mir und dieser friedlichen Vorbereitung. Die Routine begann mit händischer Vertrautheit. Das Bett machen, die Laken glatt ziehen, die Daunendecke aufschütteln und die Kissen in ihren gestärkten Bezügen genau an der Kopfstütze platzieren. Jede Bewegung war ein ritueller Akt, die Ordnung. Ich ging die Treppe hinunter, die Holzstufen unter meinen nackten Füßen. Leicht knarrend und wurde von der wärmeren Luft der Küche und dem nun volleren Kaffeeduft empfangen. Die peculiare Maschine aus emuliertem Stahl stand auf der formigen Arbeitsplatte und blubberte leise vor sich hin. Ihr Glasdom zeigte den dunklen, kesselnden Tank. Ich schenkte mir eine Tasse ein, den Dampf, der mir ins Gesicht stieg, und ließ den ersten bitterwarmen Schluck auf der Zunge zergehen. Das Frühstück war ein einfaches Ballett. Der elektrische Toaster, ein chromglänzendes Ungetüm, nahm 2 Scheiben des weißen, geschnittenen Brotes auf, während sie brutzelten und nach verbranntem Getreide rochen, legte ich Streifen von kaltem, fettigem Speck in die schwere Gusseisenpfanne. Das Zischen, als sie auf das heiße Fett trafen, war ein befriedigendes Geräusch. Ich schlug Eier in eine Schüssel auf, das Gelb und Weiß vermischte sich unter den rhythmischen Schlägen. Eine Schneebesensen zu einem gleichmäßigen Gelb. All dies war die Grammatik meines Morgens, eine Sprache, die ich von meiner Mutter gelernt hatte. Es war Arbeit, aber es war echte Arbeit, die mit den Händen und den Sinnen verrichtet wurde, die ein konkretes, duftendes Ergebnis hatte. Da als ich nach der Schüssel griff, blieb mein Blick am oberen Küchenschrank hängen. Zwischen dem Sack Mehl und der Packung Backpulver stand eine neue, ungewohnte Box. Ihre Farben waren heller, fröhlicher, ein kühnes Rot und Gelb. Just add water pancake mix, verkündete die Aufschrift in schwungvoller Schrift, light and fluffy in minutes. Ein Bild zeigte einen hohen Stapel perfekter, goldbrauner Pfannkuchen, der neben einer lächelnden Frau in einer makellosen Schürze, die eine Sirupflasche hielt. Ich hatte sie letzte Woche im Supermarkt gekauft, verführt von der Verheißung unter dem neuen daran, ein kleines Experiment in meiner eigenen Küche. Meine Hand zögerte über der Schublade mit dem Schneebissen. Die Eier in der Schüssel warteten, der Speck brutzelte in seinem eigenen Fett. Ein innerer Dialog begann. Leise aber beharrlich von Grund auf neu, das bedeutete mehr sie. Big Pulver, Salz, Zucker abmessen, ein Ei aufschlagen, Milch hinzufügen. Es war ein Verfahren, das 10 Minuten dauerte, nicht viel länger als die Box versprach. Aber es war mein Verfahren. Es war das, was meine Mutter jeden Sonntagmorgen tat. Ihr Schneebissen klapperte gegen die Porzellanschüssel wie ein Metronom der Tradition. Der Duft ihrer Pfannkuchen war komplexer, butteriger, mit einer subtilen Süße, die von echter Vanille stammte, nicht von einem natürlichen Aroma. Die Box hingegen versprach Einfachheit. Nur Wasser hinzufügen, umrühren, ausgießen. Kein Durcheinander, mit Mehlsäcken, keine Gefahr von Klümpchen. Es war sauber, es war modern, es war der Fortschritt, der direkt in meinen Schrank eingezogen war. Ich blickte aus dem Fenster über die Spüle der Nachbarin, Mrs. Henderson. Zog gerade ihre Jalousien hoch. Ich stellte mir vor, dass sie vielleicht auch eine solche Box in ihrem Schrank hatte. Vielleicht servierte sie bereits diese leichtfluffigen Pfannkuchen, hatte mehr Zeit, um die Frisur ihrer Tochter zu machen oder die Zeitung zu lesen, bevor der Tag richtig begann. Ein leiser Druck, unsichtbar, aber spürbar, legte sich in mich. Wahres Dummheit, Zeit und Mühe für etwas zu verschwenden, das genauso gut aus einer Schachtel kommen konnte. Oder war es ein kleines Heldentum, an der Echtheit festzuhalten, mit einem leisen Seufzen, der mehr in meiner Brust als in der Luft erklang, schloss ich die Schublade mit dem Schneebissen. Meine Hände griffen stattdessen nach der Pen, schwenkten den Speck, gossen das überschüssige Fett in eine alte Konservendose. Ich goss die verquillten Eier hinein, beobachtete, wie sie sofort an den Rändern fest wurden. Das Zischen war ein vertrautes Lied. Die Pfannkuchenmischung blieb in ihrem Schrank, ein stiller Zeuge meiner Entscheidung. Heute nicht. Vielleicht am Samstag, wenn die Kinder sie probieren wollten. Ein besonderes Treat. Die Rechtfertigung fühlte sich dünn an, aber sie trug mich den Moment. Ich trug den Speck und das Rührei. Ich trug den bereits gedeckten Tisch, stellte die Toastschüssel daneben. Die Stille draußen begann sich aufzulösen. Irgendwo sprang ein Motor an, eine vor der Tür schlug zu. Der Tag, der wahre Tag, stand in den Startlöchern. Ich setzte mich mit meiner zweiten Tasse Kaffee hin, blickte auf mein einfaches, von Grund auf gekochtes Frühstück und spürte einen seltsamen Mix aus Stolz und einem nagenden Gefühl. Ich könnte mich langsam aber sicher von etwas abkoppeln, etwas Wesentlichem, das nicht durch die Bequemlichkeit in der roten und gelben Box ersetzt werden konnte. Es wohne eine Schachtel Pfannkuchenmischung. Und doch fühlt es sich an wie die erste. Leise Salve in einem stillen Krieg, der in meiner eigenen Küche ausgetragen wurde. The silence that descended after the front door clicked shut behind my husband was of a different quality than the dawn's hush. This was a hollow, expectant silence, the house holding its breath, every surface seeming to await its purpose. The breakfast dishes sat in the sink, a quiet reproach. The children's laughter and the slam of the screen door echoes now, absorbed into the walls. This was my domain, and the work that filled it was a liturgy performed in solitude. I tied my everyday apron, a simple floral print cotton, over my house dress, the strings a familiar knot at the small of my back. The morning's gentle conflict over the pancake mix receded, replaced by the tangible dust-moted reality of the tasks at hand. I began with the dusting, the lamb's wool duster, its handle smooth from years of use, was an extension of my arm. I moved from the living room's substantial console television, its mahogany veneer a magnet for fingerprints, across the end tables with their doilies and ceramic figurines, a shepherdess, a pair of kittens. Each sweep was a light, whispering touch, a negotiation with the invisible. Dust was the ever-present enemy, a silent testament to time passing, to entropy. I lifted each knick-knack, dusted beneath it, and replaced it precisely in its own faint ring on the polished wood. The sun, now higher, slanted through the picture window, illuminating the swirling galaxies of motes I had disturbed. My mother never had a lamb's wool duster. Her tool was a series of soft, worn rags, dampened and wrung out, leaving a streak-free shine on every surface. Her dusting was a slower, wetter affair, each stroke a cleaning, not just a displacement. I could almost see her, in her own spotless kitchen, her movements economical and sure, no electric hum to accompany her labour, only the sound of her own breathing and the soft swipe of cloth on wood. The vacuum cleaner waited in the hall closet, a hulking, canister-shaped beast of enamelled steel and chrome. Pulling it out was a small act of exertion, its weight substantial and unwieldy. I unwound the cord, plugged it into the baseboard socket, and flipped the switch. The machine roared to life, a monstrous grinding growl that instantly consumed all other sound. It vibrated under my hands as I pushed it across the broadloom carpet, its beta bar agitating the fibres, sucking up the hidden grit. The noise was a physical presence, filling my skull, making thought impossible. This was not meditative. It was a battle. I guided the monster around chair legs and under tables, the cord snaking behind me like an umbilical tether to the wall outlet. My mother had beaten rugs on a line in the backyard with a woven wire beater, the thwack, 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 a sharp percussion against the open air. Her floors were swept with a bristled broom, each stroke pushing a little tide of dust ahead of it. A quiet, rhythmic swish. My machine was faster, undoubtedly more thorough in its deep cleaning, but it felt alien, a noisy intruder shattering the peace it was meant to create. Once the beast was silenced and returned to its closet, a different quiet resumed, one that felt earned. The carpet bore the neat parallel tracks of the vacuum's passage, a temporary signature of order. Next came the kitchen floor. I filled a bucket with hot, soapy water, the sharp, clean scent of Fell's naphtha soap rising with the steam. On my knees, with a scrub brush and a rag, I attacked the linoleum tiles. Each black and white square was a small canvas. I scrubbed at a faint, sticky spot of grape jelly, worked the brush into the grout lines where dirt gathered insidiously. The warm water soaked through the knees of my house dress, a familiar damp discomfort. The physicality of it was grounding. The push and pull of muscles in my shoulders, the ache beginning in my lower back. This was work you could see with immediate visual results. The tiles emerged gleaming, a checkerboard of reflected window light. My mother's knees knew this ache intimately, but her floors were likely wide plank wood, scrubbed. With sand and lye soap, a harsher, more elemental task. My linoleum was a modern marvel, easy to clean, cheerful in its pattern. Yet the act of cleaning it connected me to her across the years, a shared, silent understanding of what it meant to care for a home on a cellular level. Exhausted, I poured the dirty water down the sink, watching the grey swirl disappear. The house now smelled of soap and vacuum-heated dust, and the faint, lemony polish I'd used on the furniture. It was the smell of accomplishment, sterile and clean. I untied my apron and sank for a moment onto the living room sofa, its nubby upholstery scratchy against my arms. On the coffee table, next to the cut glass candy dish, lay the latest issue of Good Housekeeping. The cover showed a woman with a flawless, flipped hairdo, smiling serenely as she placed a casserole dish on a perfectly set table. I picked it up, the pages crisp and fragrant with ink. I flipped idly past advertisements for new refrigerators and miracle fabrics until an article headline caught my eye: Time Management for the Modern Housewife. Work smarter, not harder. It was illustrated with diagrams of efficient kitchen layouts and charts for scheduling chores. The text spoke of streamlining and maximizing your leisure minutes. It advised creating a household control journal. My eyes skimmed the words, a part of me intrigued by the promise of order, of mastering the endless cycle. But right beside this article, taking up half the page, was a vibrant advertisement. A can of soup, rendered in possibly glossy red and white, sat next to a bowl filled with a steaming, perfect substance. Campbell's tomato soup, the copy declared. The secret ingredient for a happy, hurry-up supper. The smiling woman here was not scrubbing floors, she was pouring soup from the can into a pot, her expression one of relieved cleverness. The juxtaposition was jarring. On one side, the intellectual pursuit of managerial efficiency. On the other, the simple, canned solution. One promised control through organization, the other through a product that eliminated the need for organization altogether. Both sold the same dream. More time. Time for what? The article didn't specify, and the advertisement implied it was for smiling, for being serene and available. I closed the magazine and set it back on the table, aligning its edges perfectly with the table's corner. The quiet of the house felt different now, pregnant not just with peace, but with a low hum of expectation, a question hanging in the clean, still air. The work was done for now, but the measurement of it, the value of it, seemed to be shifting under my feet, as surely as the patterns on the linoleum floor. The clean, static silence left by the vacuum's roar was a brief cathedral. It was soon displaced by the next sacrament of the day, one of water and steam and chemical perfume. The laundry room was not a room at all, but a curtained alcove off the kitchen, housing the twin totems of modern laundry, the top-loading washing machine and its companion, the centrifugal wringer, both enamelled in a cheerful mint green. The sorted baskets waited, a mound of white cottons, a pile of coloured prints, the darker work clothes of my husband. The sensory overload began as I lifted the heavy lid, the humid breath of previous washes escaping. I measured soap flakes from a cardboard box, their clean, flat scent a promise, then added a careful capful of liquid bleach, its acrid swimming pool tang cutting through the soapiness, a smell of such aggressive purity it made the eyes water. I turned the dial a satisfying ceramic click and pulled the knob. The machine shuddered, then water roared into the tub, a hot, thundering cascade that drowned out all thought. Steam billowed up, condensing on the cool metal of the wringer and dampening the curls at my temples. I fed the clothes in, watching the whites disappear into the churning, soapy vortex. The machine had a rhythm of its own, a gurgling swallow, a heavy, sloshing rotation, a moment of stillness, then the cycle repeated. It was a mechanical digestion. My grandmother had boiled linens in a copper kettle over a fire, her face flushed from the heat, battling stains with a washboard and a bar of lye soap that cracked her knuckles. My machine did the battling for me, its agitator a relentless mechanical fist. I felt a distant gratitude, but it was tempered by the machine's impersonal violence. It treated my husband's best Sunday shirt with the same brutal efficiency as a kitchen rag. When the final drain gurgled, the real test began. I released the wringer, its two rubber rollers poised like hungry jaws, fishing the first sopping garment from the tub, a bedsheet. I guided its edge between the rollers. With a practiced turn of the handle, the rollers seized it, squeezing out a torrent of grey, soapy water that splashed back into the tub. The sheet emerged from the other side, flattened and damp, not dripping. It was a mesmerizing, dangerous ballet. The pull was strong. I had to feed steadily, carefully, keeping fingers well clear of the roller's insatiable grip. A neighbour down the street had caught her sleeve 2 years prior. The memory of her scream and the subsequent frantic unbolting of the machine was a quiet legend among the women on the block. Each piece passed through. Pillowcases, my daughter's pinafores, my husband's work pants, heavy and reluctant. The physicality was constant. The weight of waterlogged cotton, the steady cranking of the arm, the fine spray misting my apron and forearms. The basket of damp, compressed laundry was heavy on my hip as I pushed through the screen door into the backyard. The sun was high now, a benevolent eye in a vast blue sky. The clothesline stretched from a metal pole near the house to the trunk of the old maple, a tight wire waiting for its purpose. The clothespin bag, a faded floral pouch, hung from the line's start. This was the part that felt ancient, almost pastoral. I shook out a bedsheet. The snap of the fabric, a sharp report in the quiet yard. I pinned it to the line, the wooden clothespins gripped in my teeth, releasing one by one to secure the heavy cotton. The wind caught it immediately, billowing it into a great white sail. Shirt by shirt, sock by sock, the line filled, transforming into a gallery of our domestic life. The sturdy flannel of work shirts, the delicate lace of a slip, the small, bold prints of the children's play clothes. The sun warmed the back of my neck, and the smell of wet cotton and grass and the faint, clean residue of bleach filled the air. This act felt like creation, not just cleaning. I was painting with fabric and light, and the slow, gentle dance of the clothes in the breeze was my finished canvas. Standing back, wiping my damp hands on my apron, I felt the deep, bone-level fatigue of the morning settle in. It was a good tiredness, earned in muscles and sinew. Yet, gazing at the fluttering line, a gentle irony bloomed. All this work, the sorting, the measuring, the wrestling with steam and weight, would be invisible by evening. The sheets would be dry, folded, tucked into linen closets. The shirts would be pressed, hanging in closets, smelling of sunshine and ironing starch. A made bed showed no evidence of the struggle to heave its mattress. A clean floor betrayed no memory of the scrubbing brush. A perfectly ordered home was not an achievement to be marvelled at. It was simply the expected, neutral state. Its maintenance was a continuous, disappearing act. Looks like you got a good day for it. The voice, cheerful and familiar, came from over the picket fence. Mrs. Ellis, my neighbour to the west, was pinning up her own wash, her line a parallel universe of pastels and stripes. She wore a similar house dress, her hair in a neat netted roll. I called back, walking to the fence, a little breeze to help it along. We leaned on the weathered wood, a brief sanctioned pause in the industry of the day. Our conversations were often like this, conducted over fences or across driveways, snippets of camaraderie woven into chores. "Say," she said, her voice dropping into a confidential tone, though no one else was in earshot, "did you try that new seasoned hamburger they have at the A&P? The one in the tube?" I'd seen it, a strange chubby cylinder of ground beef, pre-mixed with onions and spices, wrapped in shiny waxed paper. It sat in the meat case, looking both convenient and slightly unsettling. "Not yet," I admitted. "Is it any good?" Mrs. Ellis made a considering face, her head tilted. "Well, it's certainly quick. No chopping, no mess." Jim said he couldn't tell much difference from my meatloaf. She said this last part with a hint of defensive pride, then softened. "But you know, it's got a uniformity to it. Every bite tastes exactly the same. Not necessarily bad, just predictable, like it forgot to be homemade." She gave a little laugh, as if dismissing her own critique. "But it shaves 20 minutes off supper prep." "Can't argue with that." I nodded, understanding perfectly the calculus she was describing, the trade of subtle flavour for measurable time. We stood for another moment in companionable silence, watching our laundry flutter like peaceful flags. Then a child's cry sounded from her kitchen window. "Duty calls," she sighed, smiling wearily, and turned back to her basket. I returned to my empty line, the wicker basket, mail light at my feet. The visit was over, but her words lingered. Time uniformity. Predictable. They described the seasoned hamburger, but they could just as easily describe the gleaming linoleum, the vacuum-tracked carpet, the perfectly aligned figurines on the dusted end table. There was a new kind of perfection being offered, one that came not from variable human effort, but from a controlled, consistent process, whether in a factory or facilitated by a machine in my own home. The fatigue I felt was from the old kind of work. The expectation I was beginning to sense was for the new kind of result, flawless, effortless, and as uniform as the clothes pinned in identical rows, dancing to the same silent wind. The weekly pilgrimage required preparation. The list, written in my neat cursive on the back of a used envelope, was a bulwark against temptation. Milk, bread, eggs, coffee, sugar, flour, ground beef, carrots, potatoes, lettuce, the fundamentals. I tucked it into my purse alongside my leather coin purse, checked my reflection in the hall mirror. A quick pat to my set hair, a straightening of my good cardigan, and stepped out into the mid-morning sun. The car, a vast, two-toned sedan, waited in the driveway, its chrome gleaming. The essay, drive to the new A&P, was short, just 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing into a different country. We passed the old downtown with its separate specialized shops, the butcher with sawdust on the floor, the greengrocer with wooden crates spilling onto the sidewalk, the dry goods store with its giant wheels of cheese under glass bells. Their windows seemed dimmer now, like memories. My mother had shopped that way, moving from store to store, her string bag growing heavier, her conversations with each shopkeeper a ritual of community. I felt a faint pang of disloyalty as I drove past, my hands steady on the wide steering wheel, heading for the kingdom of convenience. The supermarket parking lot was a revelation in itself. A vast, flat plain of asphalt, dotted with cars, a monument to automotive abundance. The building was long and low, all glass and gleaming white panels, crowned with a bold red sign. It hummed with a new kind of energy. Pushing through the heavy glass doors was like stepping into a future crafted from light and colour. The air was cool, artificially chilled, and carried a complex symphony of smells. The waxy perfume of apples, the clean chemical scent of floor polish, the faint sweet odour of plastic and paper. Overhead, long rows of fluorescent tubes bathed everything in a shadowless, brilliant glare, banishing every corner of mystery. It was daytime at midnight. My eyes needed a moment to adjust, not to darkness, but to this overwhelming illumination. My cart, a massive steel basket on clattering wheels, felt like a chariot. I guided it onto the polished terrazzo floor, its path smooth and effortless. The aisles stretched before me, canyons of abundance, each one a meticulously organized taxonomy of modern desire. To my right, the produce section was a still life of almost unnatural perfection. The apples were uniform spheres of glossy red, stacked in precise pyramids. The lettuce heads were tight, pale green bouquets, each wrapped in crisp cellophane. It was beautiful, yet it lacked the earthy, sometimes bruised personality of the greengrocer's wares. Here, everything had been curated for visual appeal, its imperfections culled before it ever reached the light. But it was the inner aisles that truly held the new magic. Here, the walls were built not of wood or brick, but of countless cans, boxes, and packages, a kaleidoscope of commercial art. Labels screamed in cheerful typography. A cartoon elf offered ready-mix cake. A grinning, mustachioed chef presided over a can of spaghetti. The colours were brighter than any found in nature. Electric oranges, radioactive greens, sunshine yellows. My list dictated a turn down the baking aisle for flour and sugar, yet my progress slowed, my eyes snagged by the neighbouring shelves. Here sat an entire universe of pre-mixed possibilities. A box for brownies requiring only an egg and oil, a packet for biscuits where you just added milk. A canister of whip and chill dessert that promised a chocolate mousse in minutes. They stood in neat rows, soldiers in the war against time, each box a little fortress containing a finished dream. My hand hovered near a mix for 7-minute frosting. I thought of the careful hot water bath and the patient beating required for my mother's boiled frosting. The risk of failure if the sugar crystallized. 7 minutes seemed a small miracle, a theft from the clock. Pushing onward, I entered the realm of canned goods. They were no longer just humble peas or corn. Here were entire meals suspended in brine, beef stew with vegetables, chicken lacking, SpaghettiOs with meatballs. The illustrations on the labels showed steaming, generous portions, the meat chunks plump, the vegetables distinct. I picked up a can of the stew, its metal cool and heavy in my hand. The ingredient list was a small block of text. Amidst the expected beef, potatoes and carrots were words that felt chemical alien: monosodium glutamate, disodium inacinate, hydrolyzed vegetable protein. They sounded like things from a laboratory, not a kitchen. A mild confusion settled in me. What were these substances? Were they the source of the rich, savoury taste promised by the picture? Were they safe? The label offered no answers, only the reassurance of the brand name and a brightly coloured seal. I placed the can back on the shelf, its mystery unresolved. The social pressure was a quiet, ambient force, as present as the muzak piping softly from hidden speakers. Other women glided through the aisles, their carts filling with these very items. I saw a woman about my age drop 2 boxes of hamburger helper into her basket without a second glance. Another loaded a stack of TV dinners, their aluminum trays showing through the cardboard windows. Fried chicken, Salisbury steak, turkey with dressing. They moved with an air of competent modernity, masters of this new domain. To cling stubbornly to my list, to bypass these marvels began to feel not thrifty or traditional, but oddly backward. A refusal of progress offered with a smile. The climax of this sensory safari was the new frozen food section. It was a wall of white gleaming chest freezers, their glass lids fogged with cold. Inside, a wonderland of frost-rimed packages lay in orderly rows. I saw frozen peas, yes, but also frozen French fries, frozen fish sticks shaped like little boats, frozen fruit pies. And there, in a section of its own, was the pinnacle, the TV dinner. The illustration showed a partitioned aluminum tray, each compartment holding a perfect miniature meal, a golden brown drumstick, neat cubes of dressing, bright orange carrots, a square of apple cobbler. It was a complete, portion-controlled universe. No prep, no mess, just heat and eat, the box proclaimed. The image of the family gathered around the television, trays on their laps, everyone happy, was powerfully seductive. It promised not just a meal, but an experience, a liberation from the kitchen. My cart held the mundane items from my list. The flour, the potatoes, the plain ground beef. They suddenly seemed drab, demanding. I stood before the freezer, the chill rising to kiss my face. The decision felt larger than dinner. It was a vote for a new way of living. With a breath that felt like stepping off a ledge, I opened the heavy glass lid, the cold air rushing out in a cloud, and selected a turkey dinner. I placed it carefully in my cart, the box crisp and cold against the other groceries. It landed with a quiet, definitive thud. The act was a surrender, but it was also an adoption of a new identity. The modern housewife, savvy, time-conscious, unafraid of the future. I completed my rounds, adding a box of instant mashed potatoes. Just add boiling water. At the checkout, the clerk, a young man in a crisp apron, rang up my items with efficient clicks. The TV dinner slid down the conveyor belt like a trophy. I paid, loaded the brown paper bags into my car, and drove home. The groceries in the trunk seemed to carry a new weight, a silent, packaged potential. The safari was over. I had ventured into the jungle of modernity and returned with its most iconic prey. The familiar kitchen awaited, but it would now house this strange frozen artifact, a symbol of the gentle, inexorable shift occurring one shopping trip at a time. The groceries were put away, their rustling paper bags folded and stored under the sink for later use. The canned goods lined the pantry shelf, the frozen TV dinner, now a resident in the icy tundra of the freezer, nestled beside the ice cube trays, the house, having absorbed the morning's labour and the new acquisitions, settled into its midday rhythm. This was the intermission, a pocket of silence between the acts of morning industry and the impending clamour of afternoon and evening. The children were at school, my husband at the office, and the neighbourhood seemed to hold its collective breath under the high, bright sun. This hour belonged solely to me, a fact that felt both like a luxury and a vast, empty plain. Lunch was a solitary, simple affair. I assembled a sandwich from the morning's leftover bacon, a single leaf of the crisp iceberg lettuce, and a smear of mayonnaise on white bread. I cut it diagonally, the knife gliding through the soft loaf with a quiet whisper. I poured a glass of milk, its cold whiteness, a contrast to the rich, salty bacon. Carrying the plate and glass to the living room, I set them on a small tray table beside the armchair. The act felt faintly illicit, eating in a room meant for company. but the formality of the kitchen table seemed excessive for just one. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drone of a car passing on Maple Street. I ate slowly, tasting each bite, the crunch of lettuce, the chew of bread, the smoky fat of the bacon. The simplicity was comforting, a direct line to hunger and satisfaction, unmediated by boxes or instructions. When the last crumb was gone, I turned my attention to the television. It was a daily ritual, this half-hour window of the Homemaker's Hour, a program that bridged the gap between instruction and advertisement. I switched the set on, waiting for the tubes to warm up, the grey screen flickering to life with a soft electronic sigh. The familiar logo appeared, a stylized house with a smiling sun where the chimney should be, accompanied by a sprightly generic tune. The hostess Eleanor materialized on screen. She was perpetually in her late 30s, with a perfectly set helmet of blonde hair, a crisp shirtwaist dress, and a smile that was both warm and unyielding. Her set was a model kitchen, brighter and more colourful than any real one, all primary colours and gleaming, unused appliances. "Welcome back, ladies," she began, her voice a smooth contralto, soothing as syrup. "Today, we're tackling a common kitchen conundrum, the humble potato. Peeling, boiling, mashing. It can eat up precious minutes of your afternoon." She held up a real earthy potato in one hand, and in the other, a box of instant mashed potatoes, its graphics showing a cloud-like mound of pure white. But what if I told you you could have fluffy, delicious mashed potatoes on your table in less than 5 minutes, thanks to the marvels of modern food science? You can. Her tone was that of a benevolent scientist revealing a wonderful secret. She demonstrated boiling a kettle of water, then pouring the hot water over the curious flakes in a bowl. With a few swift stirs of a fork, the pale powder metamorphosed into a stiff, then creamy substance. "No peeling, no boiling over, no lumps," she declared, presenting the bowl to the camera. The potatoes looked smooth, uniform, and utterly sterile. "It's not just a time saver, girls. It's consistent. A perfect result every single time, giving you more moments for the things that truly matter." The things that truly matter remained undefined, but her gesture encompassed the bright, child-free, perfectly clean set around her. The program seamlessly transitioned, as it always did, into a sponsored segment. Eleanor's smile didn't waver as she held up a curious product, a foil pouch labelled "Scramble Eggs," for those busy mornings when even cracking an egg feels like a chore. She confided, her voice dropping to an intimate pitch. "Just snip, pour and scramble. Real egg taste, with added vitamins, and absolutely no shell to worry about. It's breakfast deconstructed and reconvenience." She poured a viscous yellow liquid from the pouch into a skillet, where it sizzled and solidified into a perfect rubbery-looking circle. The language she used was a careful alloy of domestic warmth and technological promise. Words like food science, fortified, engineered for ease, and time motion studies were sprinkled amongst wholesome, family-friendly, and your secret weapon. The implication was clear. The old way was not just slower, it was inefficient, almost irresponsible. Tradition was a sentimental obstacle to progress, and progress was measured in minutes shaved off a core. I watched, my hands folded in my lap, the empty lunch plate forgotten. The commercials that followed were variations on the same theme. A sparkling clean woman in pearls wrestled heroically with a stalk of celery and a knife, only to be rescued by a can of pre-chopped soup starter vegetables. A flustered mother faced with a birthday cake crisis was redeemed by a box of rainbow-flecked cake mix and a can of ready-spread frosting. In each vignette, the problem was the raw ingredient itself, the sheer effort of transformation. The solution was always a brightly coloured package that performed the alchemy for you. The narrative was one of rescue. These products weren't just selling food. They were selling absolution from guilt and a passport to a calmer, more composed version of womanhood. The woman who used them was not lazy. She was smart, modern, and in control of her time. The woman who persisted in peeling her own potatoes was, by subtle extension, a martyr to a pointless cause. A quiet tension built within me as I watched. Part of me, the tired part that still felt the ache in my knees from scrubbing the floor, listened to Eleanor's promises and yearned for that ease. The vision of a 5-minute side dish was powerfully seductive. Yet another part, older and rooted deeper, recoiled at the imagery. The instant potatoes looked like paste. The egg from a pouch had no variation in its texture, no dark golden spots from real butter in the pan. These were simulacra of food, homages to efficiency rather than nourishment. The language of science used to sell them felt like an invasion, a colonizing of the kitchen, a place that had always run on the softer sciences of intuition, taste and inherited touch. The program concluded with Eleanor's final smile, and a reminder to tune in tomorrow for a segment on streamlining your linen closet. The screen faded to a test pattern. I reached over and turned the knob, the click loud in the sudden returning silence. The cheerful music and the bright, insistent voices were gone, leaving only the solid, quiet reality of my living room. The sunlight still slanted across the carpet, but it felt different now, less peaceful, more accusatory. The empty plate on the tray seemed to represent a choice that was shrinking daily. I could almost hear the whisper from the pantry, from the box of instant potatoes I had bought on my safari. It whispered of time, of consistency, of modernity, and from the memory of my mother's kitchen, from the feel of a real potato, knobby and dirty in my hand, its skin coming away, under the peeler, in a long, earthy curl, came a fainter, older whisper. It spoke of texture, of variability, of a process that was itself a kind of knowing. The midday pause was over, but the silence it left behind was now filled with a low, persistent debate. A quiet propaganda that had followed me home from the supermarket and now played on a screen, selling me a future where my hands might be cleaner, but my role felt more complicated than ever. The heavy quiet of the post-lunch hour was a different creature than the morning's expectant hush. This was a languid, sun-drenched silence, thick and slow as honey. The urgency of chores had abated, leaving behind the more meditative, almost decorative tasks. The ironing board unfolded with a familiar, protesting creak, its padded cover smelling faintly of old starch and heat. I plugged in the iron, a solid, triangular wedge of chrome and enamel, and waited for it to heat, listening to its low internal grumble. From the wicker laundry basket, I lifted my husband's first white shirt. It was still slightly damp from the line, carrying the scent of sun and wind, the fabric stiffening as it dried. I shook it out, the pop of the cotton a sharp sound in the still room, and laid it across the board, aligning seams with a precision born of endless repetition. As I worked, I switched on the small transistor radio on the kitchen counter, sputtered to life, filling the room not with the aggressive cheer of television, but with the softer, melodic flow of a midday program. A smooth-voiced announcer introduced a segment from the Home Living Forum featuring a guest expert, a Dr. Phyllis Thornburg. Her voice was crisp, authoritative, yet soothing. And today we're addressing a very modern malady, she was saying, her tone confidential, what many are calling housewife fatigue. That feeling of being constantly busy, yet somehow never finished. My iron moved in slow, gliding passes over the shirt's yoke, the hot metal hissing as it met the damp cloth, releasing a puff of clean steam. I listened, my hands working autonomously. The key, Dr. Thornburg advised, is not to work harder, but to simplify your expectations. Look at your meal planning, for instance. Does every dinner need to be a 3-course production? The new frozen entrees and ready mixes are miracles of convenience for a reason. Embrace them. A satisfied family is built on a mother's calm presence, not on her exhaustion over a stove. The advice was delivered with such rational certainty. I finished the shirt, buttoned it down the front, and hung it on a wooden hanger, its shoulders perfectly squared. I selected another, a pale blue broadcloth. The radio segued into music, the gentle orchestral swell of a Schlager melody. The singer's voice was wistful and sweet, crooning about alpine meadows and lost love, a world away from formica and laundry starch. The combination was strangely potent, the practical, cutting-edge advice layered over the sentimental, old-world tune. It was as if the radio itself couldn't decide what era this afternoon belonged to. With the music as a soundtrack, my gaze began to wander, not out the window, but inward across the surfaces of my own domain. The iron slid back and forth, but my mind drifted over the very materials that constituted my life. The ironing board itself was covered in a silvery, heat-resistant fabric that felt slick and synthetic under my palm. My eyes lifted to the kitchen. The countertop was a sheet of formica, its boomerang pattern a chaotic swirl of white and charcoal grey, trapped under a glossy, impervious seal. It was indestructible. Coffee stains, knife nicks, the hot bottom of a pot. Nothing marred its surface. It promised eternal newness, a cleanliness that was not earned but inherent. I thought of my mother's worn wooden dough board, its surface cross-hatched with the scars of 1,000 meals, stained dark by years of oil and flour. That board told a story. My formica told no stories. It only repelled them. My gaze moved to the kitchen table. It was draped in a nylon tablecloth, a cheerful print of strawberries and vines. It was vibrant, stain-resistant, and when spilled upon, it required only a damp cloth to wipe away the evidence. It never needed washing, never faded in the sun. It was always presentably cheerful. I remembered the heavy white linen cloths of my childhood, the ritual of washing, starching and ironing them, the crisp, formal feel of them on special occasions. They demanded care. This nylon cloth demanded nothing. It simply was. On it sat the vinyl chair seats, smooth and cool, patterned to mimic woven cane, but without any of its texture or give. They wiped clean with a swipe. Everything in my line of sight was engineered for easy maintenance. The linoleum floor, the vinyl-coated wallpaper, the fiberglass curtain shears, all were soldiers in the army against mess, against time, against the organic decay of living. The iron hissed steadily. The Schlager song ended, replaced by another with a similar lilt, and in the space between the music's refrain and the steam's sigh, the fault emerged, not as a sharp revelation, but as a slow, cold seepage, like water finding a crack in a foundation. This abundance of new time-saving products, the formica, the ready mixes, the wash and wear fabrics. What if their promise was a trick? The explicit promise was freedom. Freedom from scrubbing, from staining, from long hours of preparation. But the freedom they offered seemed to create a vacuum, and nature abhorred a vacuum. Into that vacant space were flowing new, more insidious expectations. If the floor was so easy to clean, then it could be cleaned daily without being a burden. If dinner could be made in 20 minutes, then there was time to bake cookies for the PTA meeting as well. If shirts never wrinkled, then a husband could always appear crisply professional, reflecting well on the home. The fatigue Dr. Tyre Thornburg described wasn't from the old labour, the back-breaking scrubbing, the all-day laundering. That fatigue had been clear, its source visible in red knuckles and a sore back. This new fatigue was different. It was the fatigue of the invisible checklist. The expectation was no longer just a clean house, but an effortlessly clean house which allowed for a beautifully coordinated family, a socially active calendar, a wife and mother who was not just capable but serene and aesthetically pleasing while doing it all. The products sold me time, but the culture surrounding them seemed to sell me a new, more expansive job description to fill that time. The goalposts had moved. Perfection was no longer a hard-won victory over dirt and time. It was a baseline state enabled by science, and therefore any deviation from it, a dusty corner, a simple, unadorned meal, felt like a personal failing, a lack of savvy in using the very tools designed to liberate me. I finished the last shirt, a small one belonging to my son. I unplugged the iron, its metal face cooling with a series of soft ticks. The radio played on, now a commercial for a new aerosol furniture polish that promised a lustrous protective shine in half the time. I folded the ironing board and put it away, the shirts hanging in a solemn, orderly row on the doorframe, like ghosts of the day's labour. The afternoon sun had moved, casting long, slanting rectangles of light across the nylon tablecloth and the vinyl chairs, making them glow with a false, theatrical warmth. The house was tidy, every surface wiped, every garment pressed. It was the picture of modern efficiency, yet the quiet satisfaction I might have once felt was tinged with a new vague anxiety. I was surrounded by miracles that demanded nature, and in their undemanding nature, they seemed to ask for everything. They dreamed tidy dreams on my behalf, and I was left to live inside them, wondering if the key to the prison of old-fashioned work had simply opened the door to a brighter, quieter, more spacious cell. The late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, a rich honeyed gold that gilded the formica and made the chrome faucet gleam like a beacon. This was the pre-dinner hush, the sacred, pressurized silence that descended each day around 4 o'clock. The house was clean, the laundry folded, the children not yet home. This hour was the fulcrum upon which the evening balanced. It was the time of decision. The quiet was not peaceful. It was anticipatory, thick with the unspoken question of what would emerge from this kitchen to define the family's night. My gaze drifted between 2 points on the counter, as if watching a silent tennis match. On the left lay the Open Women's Magazine, its pages splayed to a feature titled Hearty Heartist Supper. A photograph depicted a deep ceramic casserole brimming with tender chunks of beef, carrots, pearl onions, and potatoes in a rich, glossy gravy, all nestled under a blanket of flaky golden pastry. It was a vision of rustic abundance, of labour and love made edible. The recipe column was dense with instructions. Browning the meat in batches, preparing a rooks, simmering for 2 to 3 hours until the meat was fork tender, rolling out pastry dough. The ingredient list was a poem of the familiar: chuck roast, flour, butter, beef stock, thyme, a bay leaf. It was my mother's kind of cooking, a slow alchemy that filled a house with profound, promising aromas for hours. It was also a map to a vanished afternoon. On the right sat the box. Its colours were bold, a cheerful red and yellow, its graphics simple and direct. Hamburger helper, beef pasta. A cartoonish illustration showed a smiling, gloved hand, stirring a steaming skillet. A complete meat dish in 20 minutes, the banner proclaimed. Inside that box was a universe of efficiency. A packet of dried pasta, a foil pouch of orange powder labelled cheese sauce mix, and a small packet of seasonings. The ingredient list on the side panel was a stark contrast to the magazine's poetry. It spoke of modified food starch, maltodextrin, autolyzed yeast extract, and disodium guanylate. It was a lexicon of the new kitchen, a language of function over form. The choice was laid bare, not just between 2 meals, but between 2 philosophies of time, of value, of what constituted cooking in this bright modern year. I felt the weight of the silent house around me. The casserole promised a deep, soul-satisfying accomplishment, the kind that earned a contented sigh from my husband and the clean plates of appreciative children. It also promised a kitchen strewn with dirty bowls, a flour-dusted counter, and my presence anchored to the stove for the remainder of the daylight. Watching, stirring, waiting. The box promised adequacy, swiftness, and a kitchen that could be restored to its pristine state before the first child burst through the door. It promised me, explicitly, more time. Time to maybe sit for a moment, to fix my hair, to be something other than the engine of the evening meal when my family arrived. A sigh escaped me, fogging the window pane for a second before vanishing. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a slow capitulation to the momentum of the day. My hand reached for the box. The cardboard was cool and smooth. There was a faint hollow rattle from the dried contents within. The act of opening it was itself a study in modern packaging. I used a knife to slit the top along its perforated line, the sound a crisp zip. Inside, the components were nestled in a bed of waxed paper, each in its own compartment, tidy and separate. I pulled out the foil pouch of cheese sauce mix. It was light, almost weightless, and made a soft, sandy sound when I squeezed it. The pasta was a collection of uniform, elbow-shaped tubes, pale and hard. The seasoning packet was the smallest, a tiny envelope of mystery. I turned to the refrigerator and took out the pound of plain ground beef I had bought, rejecting the pre-seasoned tube. This, at least, was a real thing. I placed the heavy cast iron skillet on the burner. The click of the gas igniter, a sharp punctuation in the quiet. I unwrapped the beef, a moist red mound, and placed it in the now hot pan. The immediate furious sizzle was a satisfying primal sound. I broke it apart with a wooden spoon, watching the red turn to grey, the crumbles shrinking and browning, releasing their rich, meaty fragrance. This part was real. This part I understood. When the meat was fully cooked, I drained the excess grease into an old coffee can, watching the clear, hot fat swirl. Then, following the simple instructions on the box, I added 2 cups of water to the skillet. It hit the hot metal with a great, angry hiss, sending up a cloud of steam that carried the scent of beef and hot iron. I stirred, loosening any browned bits from the pan's bottom. Now came the moment of transformation. I tore open the foil pouch and poured the orange powder into the skillet. It descended in a fine neon cloud, some of it catching the steam and puffing up into the air, carrying a sharp, tangy, unmistakably artificial cheese scent. I stirred it into the water and beef. The clear liquid instantly turned a milky, opaque orange, like a chemical sunset. I added the hard pasta elbows and the contents of the tiny seasoning packet, a dusting of darker orange granules and dried green flecks that might have once been parsley. I gave it all a final stir, reduced the heat to the recommended simmer, and covered the skillet with a lid. The instructions said 12 to 15 minutes. I set the timer on the stove, its ticking now the loudest sound in the kitchen. And then I waited. I washed the empty beef wrapper and my spoon, wiping down the already clean counter. The window showed the golden light deepening toward amber. In the silence, a faint whisper of guilt uncoiled. It was not a sharp guilt, but a dull, familiar ache. This was not cooking. This was assembly. I had not created a sauce. I had hydrated a powder. I had not built layers of flavour. I had followed 3 steps. The meal simmering under that lid was a product of distant factories, of chemists and conveyor belts. My contribution had been browning meat and turning on a burner, but as the timer ticked down, another feeling quieter but more potent began to assert itself. It was the anticipation of time. In roughly 10 minutes this would be done. The kitchen would be essentially clean. I would have a solid block of time before the chaos of homework and recounted school days and my husband's office stories descended. I could use it to set the table properly with the good napkins. I could check on the children's rooms. I could simply sit in the living room and listen to the end of a radio program, my hands idle in my lap. The guilt was soothed by the palpable promise of this margin, this buffer of calm I could claim for myself. The hamburger helper wasn't just making dinner. It was manufacturing leisure, or the illusion of it. It was buying me the right to be something other than a cook at the witching hour. The trade felt uneven, but in the economy of this solitary afternoon, with fatigue a real presence in my shoulders, and the magazine's elaborate casserole recipe seeming like a report from a more energetic bygone self, it was a trade I was willing to make. The timer's bell would ring soon, announcing the completion of a process that required little of me, and in that very lack of requirement, offered a strange, complicated kind of freedom. Der Geruch, der sich nun aus dem bedeckten Topf ausbreitete, war dominant und unmissverständlich. Es war der scharfe, säuerliche Duft von Prozessiertem. Käse vermischt mit dem fettigeren, aber nun verdeckten Aroma des Rinderhackfleischs und einer generischen, salzigen Würze erfüllte die Küche, verdrängte die letzten Spuren von Reinigungsmittel und frischer Luft, die durch das geöffnete Fenster gekommen war. Es war ein industrieller Duft, vertraut von den Werbeanzeigen und in Gängen des Supermarkts, aber hier, in meinem eigenen Raum, fühlte sich invasiv an wie ein Besucher, der zu laut spricht. Ich rührte einmal an, bevor ich den Deckel wieder schloss, und beobachtete, wie die einst scharren Nudeln anfingen, sich in der orangefarbenen, sich verdickenden Brühe zu biegen, Fleisch und Stärke zu einer einzigen, homogenen Masse verschmelzend. Während das Gebrei vor sich hin köchelte, wandte ich mich den anderen Vorbereitungen zu. Ich ging in die Speisekammer und holte die große, gewölbte Form aus Glas hervor. Darin ruhte seit dem Morgen mein eigener kleiner Beitrag zur modernen Küche, ein Jello-Salat. Ich hatte ihn nach dem Rezept auf der Schachtel zubereitet. Limettengelatin, aufgelöst in kochendem Wasser, dann gemischt mit kaltem Wasser und einer Dose geschälte, gewürfelte Birnen, alles gekühlt, bis es steif wurde. Ich löste die Ränder mit einem Messer und stürzte den Inhalt vorsichtig auf eine Servierplatte. Er kam mit einem leisen, saugenden Geräusch heraus, ein zitternd, smaragdverwender, smaragdgrüner Berg durchsetzt, mit den blassen, gleichmäßigen Würfeln der Birnen. Er glänzte unter der Küchenbeleuchtung, perfekt in seiner Form, ein essbares Kunstwerk, das keinerlei kulinarische Fähigkeiten voraussetzte, nur die Befolgung von Anweisungen und Geduld. Ich betrachtete ihn mit einem seltsamen Gefühl von Stolz. Es war hübsch. Es war aufregend anders als ein einfacher grüner Salat. Es war, wie die Frauenzeitschriften betonten, kreativ. Doch die Kreativität bestand lediglich in der Wahl der Gelatinfarbe und der konservierten Frucht. Die eigentliche Schöpfung hatte in einem Werk irgendwo im mittleren Westen stattgefunden. Ich richtete den Esstisch mit mehr Sorgfalt als gewöhnlich. Das gute Nylontischtuch mit den gestickelten Blumenrändern kam zum Einsatz. Ich legte die plattierten beste Schecke genau aus, stellte die Wassergläser auf Untersetzer aus Bakelett. Dann ging ich zurück ins Schlafzimmer und tauschte meine alltägliche mehlige Schürze gegen die gute aus. Sie war aus glattem, rot kariertem Baumwollstoff mit einer Spitzenapplikation an der Brust, reserviert für Geschenashept oder besondere Familienessen. Das Ansehen fühlte sich wie eine Verkleidung an, eine Geste, die die Banalität des kommenden Mahls aufwerten sollte. Wenn ich schon eine Fabrikmahlzeit servierte, dann wenigstens in angemessenem Rahmen. Der Timer in dem Herd klingelte. Ein schrilles, elektrisches Bimmel, das die Stille zerriss. Ich schaltete die Flamme aus und nahm den Deckel vom Topf. Was darin brodelte, war genau das, was die Schachtel versprochen hatte. Eine dicke, gleichmäßige Masse aus Nudeln und Fleisch, überzogen von einer glatten, opaken, neonorangen Sauce. Keine Klumpen, keine ungekochten Stellen. Ich schöpfte es in eine große weiße Servierschüssel, was einen perfekten, dampfenden Hügel bildete. Daneben stellte his den T-Jello-Bag. Das Farbschimmer war Bienenring. Lebhaft das grelle Orange des Helper neben dem giftigen Grün des Salats. Es sah aus wie das Abendessen in einer Science-Fiction-Zeitschrift, eine Mahlzeit der Zukunft. Für einen langen Moment stand ich einfach da, die Hände in den Taschen meiner guten Schürze vergraben und betrachtete die beiden Schüsseln auf. Arbeitsplatte, die Stille des Hauses schien sich zu verdichten, zu lauschen. Dies war der ruhige Moment der Wahrheit zwischen Vorbereitung und Ankunft. Die Frage, die den ganzen Nachmittag in mir gebrodelt hatte, brach nun still und vollständig an die Oberfläche. War das Kochen, das Bronnen des Fleisches war Kochen gewesen. Das war Hitze, die Rohmaterial transformierte. Aber der Rest, das Eingießen von Wasser und Pulver, das Rühren und Warten, während chemische Verdickungsmittel ihre Arbeit taten, das war Chemie, nicht Kochkunst. Es war Nahrungszubereitung im rein funktionalen Sinne. Es war die Umwandlung von Lagerbeständen in essbare Kalorien. Es war akzeptabel. Es wurde sättigen. Meine Familie würde das Essen. Wahrscheinlich so viel Kommentar, denn der Geschmack war vertraut geworden. Der Geschmack der Bequemlichkeit, selbstselfig, käsig, unkompliziert, doch etwas in mehr, etwas Tieferes als müde Knochen oder pragmatischer Verstand, empfand es als Niederlage. Es war eine Kapitulation vor der Komplexität, ein Rückzug von der Möglichkeit des Außergewöhnlichen. Das Rezept im Magazin des Rinderkasserole war eine Einladung zur Meisterschaft gewesen, eine Chance, etwas zu erschaffen, das mehr war als die Summe seiner Teile. Dies hier war die Summe seiner Teile, dies hier war die Summe seiner Teile. Dies hier war die Summe seiner Teile. Die Niederlage lag nicht im Produkt selbst, sondern in der Aufgabe der Ambition. Ich hatte die Rolle der Schöpferin gegen die der Assemblierin eingetauscht. Aber dann, wie ein Echo aus dem anderen Raum, kam die Erinnerung an die gewonnene Zeit. Die saubere Küche. Die ruhigen 20 Minuten, in denen ich nicht über einem Herd stand, sondern den Tisch decken, die Schürze wechseln, durch das stille Haus gehen konnte. Die Kinder würden bald nach Hause kommen, laut und hungrig, ihre Mäule voller Geschichten und Forderungen. Mein Mann würde folgen, seine Müdigkeit wie einen unsichtbaren Mantel tragend. Die Mahlzeit, die auf sie wartete, erforderte keine Erklärungen, keine Entschuldigungen, keine besondere Aufmerksamkeit. Sie war einfach da, bereit, ihren Zweck zu erfüllen. Und dann aus dem Weg zu geräumt zu werden, damit das wahre Leben des Abends, das Spielen, das Erzählen, das Zusammensein ungehindert fließen konnte. Ein Sieg der Logistik über die Kunst der Familie, über die Küche, der Gegenwart, über die Vergangenheit. Ich hörte das ferne Kreischen von Bremsen, das Lachen von Kindern, die sich einer Haustür näherten. De vor eben Frieden Zeres wie Papier, die Stille war vorbei. Ich nahm die Servierschüssel mit dem dampfenden, orangefarbenen Brei und trug sie zum Esstisch, stellte sie auf das Topflappenunterteil in der Mitte des blumigen Tischstücks. Der Jello-Salat wackelte leicht, als ich ihn daneben stellte. Ich trat einen Schritt zurück und überprüfte die Anordnung. Besteck, Gläser, Servierschüsseln, alles in seinem Platz. Das Bild der Hausfrau, die das Abendessen für ihre Familie aufträgt. Es sah richtig aus. Es fühlte sich in diesem letzten, einsamen Moment vor dem Sturm der Ankunft sowohl wie eine Niederlage als auch wie ein Sieg an. Eine Niederlage für die Köchin, die vielleicht hätte sein können. Ein Sieg für die Mutter und Ehefrau, die ich in dieser erschöpften Stunde zu sein versuchte. Der Geruch der Bequemlichkeit erfüllte nun das ganze Haus, ein sicheres Zeichen dafür, dass die Arbeit getan war, auch wenn ich kaum das Gefühl hatte, gearbeitet zu haben. Die Hintertür flog auf und die Welt brach mit all ihrem Lärm, ihrem Leiding und ihrem unmittelbaren Hunger herein. Ich stand da in meiner guten Schürze, bereit, sie zu empfangen, die zweifelhafte Architektin dieses einfachen, annehmbaren, völlig ausreichenden Mahl. The clamor of arrival was a wave that broke over the quiet shore of the afternoon. School bags were dropped with thuds in the hallway, shoes were kicked off, and the high, overlapping voices of the children filled the rooms, a symphony of grievances and triumphs from the day. My husband followed, his step heavier, the sigh he emitted as he hung his hat on the hall tree a familiar punctuation mark. The house, so recently a temple to order, was instantly animated, vibrating with the messy, glorious energy of lived life. The sharp, cheesy scent from the kitchen, once so dominant, was now just one thread in the richer tapestry of chalk dust, playground sweat, and the faint, clean smell of starched cotton from my husband's shirt. I called them to the table, my voice cutting through the noise. They assembled, their faces still flushed from the outside world. My daughter, her braids slightly unraveled, slid into her chair. My son, his knees scraped and dirty, followed, his eyes already fixed on the serving bowls. My husband took his place at the head of the table, unfolding his napkin with a tired automatic gesture. I brought the final items, a pitcher of ice water, a basket of sliced white bread, a dish of butter shaped into a perfect ridge sphere from its mould. Then I sat, untying my good apron, but leaving it draped over my lap, a shield against spills. The serving began. I ladled the hamburger helper onto each plate, It landed with a soft, gelatinous plop, holding its mound shape briefly before settling. The orange sauce clung to the pasta elbows and meat crumbles with a uniform consistency. I added a scoop of the shimmering green jello. Salad to the side of each plate, its quivering mass a stark, cool contrast to the hot, savoury pile. The children watched, their expressions neutral, accepting. This was not a feast to be marvelled at. It was simply dinner, the expected fuel at the end of the day. My husband served himself a generous portion, his movements efficient, his gaze already inward, mentally still at the office. We began to eat. The sounds were the sounds of any family meal. The scrape of forks on melamine plates, the clink of glasses being set down, the occasional request to pass the bread. The reactions were as neutral as the food itself. My son ate methodically, shoveling bites in without comment, his mind clearly on the model airplane waiting for him in his room. My daughter picked at her jello salad, more fascinated by its wobble than its taste. "It's green," she observed, a statement of fact, not praise. My husband took several bites, chewing thoughtfully. He swallowed, took a drink of water, and finally spoke. "Frank Nelson's retiring next month," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet mastication. "Management's bringing in some young fellow from the Chicago office to take over the department. Lots of talk about streamlining procedures," he said, the last phrase with a faint, weary irony, stabbing another forkful of the helper. He didn't remark on the food. He didn't need to. It was edible, warm, and required no conversation. It was a blank canvas upon which the news of his day could be painted, he continued, talking about the new time clock system, the rumour of a company picnic, the frustrating behaviour of the mimeograph machine. I nodded, making small sounds of understanding, my own meal growing cold as I listened. The food performed its primary function perfectly. It was sustenance that did not distract from the real business of the evening, which was the sharing of these small daily fragments of our separate worlds. After the last bites were taken, the jello salad vanished, the orange sauce mopped up with pieces of bread. The aftermath was remarkably simple. I gathered the plates. There were no pots crusted with reduced sauce, no baking dish soaked for hours, no evidence of a long, complicated process. The single skillet, already rinsed, went into the soapy water. The serving bowls were empty, easily wiped clean. The glasses bore only water rings. In less than 10 minutes, the kitchen was restored to its pre-dinner state, a formica gleaming under the overhead light, the sink empty, the monumental clean-up I had associated with a proper cooked meal, the soaking, the scouring, the army of dirty implements, was absent. It felt like a magic trick, a sleight of hand where the labour of feeding simply disappeared. This was the promised land, the dividend paid by the boxed meal. The saved time materialized as a palpable space in the evening, a soft, open expanse. My husband retreated to the living room, clicking on the television. The warm glow of the console and the murmur of a news broadcaster's voice became the new hearth. The children, instead of scattering, lingered at the cleared table. My son produced a worn board game from the hall closet, its box taped at the corners. "Can we play?" he asked, his eyes hopeful. It was a school night, usually too rushed for such things, but the clock on the wall showed a time that felt surprisingly early unburdened. We played. The roll of the dice, the movement of plastic tokens around the painted track, the silly, exaggerated groans at landing on a penalty space. My daughter leaned against my side, her hair smelling of sunshine and grass. In the other room, I could hear the steady cadence of the television, a laugh track from a sitcom, my husband's occasional low chuckle. For a half hour, I was not a housewife, a cook, a manager of chores. I was simply a player in a game, a presence on a couch, a part of the gentle, undemanding tapestry of family leisure. The quiet satisfaction was real, a warm glow in my chest. This was what the advertisements sold. This calm, this availability, this smiling mother present for her children. This wife companionably sharing the same space as her husband, not separated by a wall of steam and dirty pots. Yet, as I moved my token past go and collected my pretend salary, a flitting thought, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the contentment. What exactly had I done with all this saved time today? The question emerged from the quiet corners of the mind reserved for such inconvenient audits. I mentally retraced my steps. The morning chores, done with their usual thoroughness. The laundry, hung and later ironed. The shopping trip, the preparation of the boxed dinner and the jello salad. Had any of it been truly omitted? Had any task been erased? No. The tasks had been the same, only their nature had shifted. The cooking had been compressed and simplified, yes, but the time it freed had not been handed to me as pure leisure. It had been absorbed invisibly by the expectation of doing more, or doing things to a new standard. I had not spent the extra minutes idly dreaming. I had used them to iron more meticulously, to set a more perfect table, to create a decorative if artificial salad. The saved time had not created a vacuum of rest. It had created a vacuum filled with the subtle pressure of enhanced domestic performance. The freedom was not from labour, but from the particular respected labour of cooking from scratch. The acknowledgement for that old labour, the appreciative silence that followed a truly home-cooked meal, the visible effort that justified a weary sigh, was gone. In its place was a neutral acceptance and an invisible, more demanding checklist. The satisfaction of the evening's free moment was genuine, but it was subtly tarnished by the realization that this moment was not a gift of pure time, but a transaction. I had traded the deep, acknowledged fatigue of creation for the shallow, unrecognized busyness of perpetual, streamlined readiness. The game continued, the tokens moved, and I smiled at my children's excitement. But the flitting thought left a tiny fire distic, cold spot in the warmth of the room, a silent question hanging in the air, alongside the laughter and the comforting glow of the television screen. The final credits of the evening program rolled, a scrolling list of names against a static image of a smiling family. The television's cathode ray tube emitted a soft, persistent whine and a faint, electric odour of heated dust. With a click, the living room plunged into a deeper silence, the sudden absence of the artificial glow leaving the familiar shapes of furniture as dark silhouettes against the window's moonlight. The children were long asleep, their dreams sealed behind closed doors. My husband had retired with a murmured goodnight, the weight of his day finally settling upon him completely. Now the house was wholly mine again, but this ownership felt different than the dawn's solitary reign. This was a possession haunted by the echoes of the day's commerce, a quiet filled with the phantom jingles and promises that had seeped from the screen. I moved to the kitchen, not out of need, but from a restlessness that the evening's gain and companionship had not fully quelled. The fluorescent light over the sink buzzed to life, its harsh blue-white glare a shocking violation of the night's soft darkness. It revealed a kingdom of order. The counters were wiped bare, the skillet from dinner hung gleaming and dry on its hook. The glass jello mould, washed and upturned on a towel, sparkled like a forgotten artifact. My gaze, however, was drawn not to the cleanliness, but to the cabinets and the pantry door. Behind those plain painted surfaces stood the new army of my domain, the brightly coloured boxes, the cylindrical cans, the mysterious foil pouches. They were my silent allies, my modern conveniences. In the nocturnal quiet, they seemed less like tools and more like sentinels, guarding a new kind of truth. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner, the blue flame a silent dancing flower. From the cupboard, I retrieved a small jar of instant decaffeinated coffee. The granules were a uniform, dusty brown, unlike the rich, oily fragments of the percolated grounds from the morning. As the water heated, I turned on the small portable television on the kitchen counter, its screen a miniature version of the living room's console. The late-night movie had given way to the final block of commercials, the last, most potent wave of the day's propaganda. The volume was low, a conspiratorial murmur in the empty room. A commercial blossomed on the screen, a burst of colour and movement so vibrant it seemed to warp the tiny screen. It was a mini-musical, animated cartoon strawberries, and dancing eggs cavorted around a smiling live-action woman in a fantastically clean kitchen. The song was catchy, insipid, engineered to burrow into the brain. New strawberry swirl cake mix. The chorus sang, "Just add water, stir, and bliss." The woman, her hair in an impeccable flip, her shirt-waist dress without a wrinkle, opened her oven with a graceful, effortless motion. She pulled out a perfect, towering layer cake, its pink frosting swirled with artistic precision. She beamed, not a bead of sweat on her brow, not a smudge of flour on her cheek. The cake was presented to a table where a handsome husband and two adoring children materialized, their faces alight with joy. The message was not subtle. This mix did not just make cake, it manufactured domestic harmony, approval, and a specific, effortless kind of feminine perfection. The woman was not a cook. She was a curator of happiness, her labour so minimal it was invisible, her reward total familial adoration. The kettle whistled, a sharp, steaming shriek that cut through the jingle. I poured the boiling water into my cup, watching the granules dissolve instantly into a dark, suspiciously clear liquid. The smell was vaguely coffee-like, but thin, stripped of its earthy depth. It was coffee's echo. I carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat, letting the commercial parade continue in my peripheral vision. Another spot featured a harried mother transformed into a serene hostess by the magic of frozen cocktail sausages and a jar of neon pink dipping sauce. Another promised restful sleep through the use of a new super absorbent paper towel that made wiping up bedtime spills a 1-second affair. Each story was a tiny perfect fable of problem and solution, where the problem was always the raw, unmediated effort of traditional homemaking, and the solution was always a product that inserted itself between the woman and the work. I took a sip of the instant decaf. It was hot and bitter, but without substance, like drinking the idea of warmth. My eyes wandered from the flickering screen to the silent cabinets. This was my realm, the heart of the home. But it was no longer just a place of flour-dusted counters and the scent of simmering broth. It was now a repository for these promises, a gallery of potential transformations. The cake mix promised effortless celebration. The hamburger helper promised reclaimed evenings. The instant potatoes promised flawless consistency. The TV dinner promised liberation from the kitchen itself. They stood in rows, these colourful guards, and their quiet propaganda was more effective than any blaring jingle. They did not just suggest, they redefined. They whispered that the value of my work was not in its craft, but in its brevity. That the goal was not nourishment born of skill, but satisfaction born of efficiency. That my success was measured not by the depth of flavour in a stew, but by the number of minutes left over for a board game. I felt the gentle shift within me, not as a sudden revolution, but as a slow glacial realignment. These products were changing the yardstick. My mother's measure had been endurance, skill, the ability to stretch a budget and transform humble ingredients into sustenance. Her fatigue was honourable, the direct tax of physical creation. My measure, it seemed, was becoming managerial. It was about the clever deployment of resources, the strategic use of technology to maximize output, not of food, but of time and a certain kind of poised, unflustered demeanour. The work was becoming invisible by design, and in its invisibility it was also becoming devalued. If anyone could pour water into a powder, then what was my special domain? If the cake came out perfect every time, devoid of the risk of a fallen centre or curdled frosting, then what was my expertise worth? The last commercial faded, replaced by the test pattern's monotonous hum and glowing geometric shapes. I switched off the set. The abrupt silence was absolute. I finished my cup of faux coffee, the dregs gritty at the bottom. I rose, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the drainer. My final tour was a slow patrol through the quiet canyons of the kitchen. My hand brushed the cool enamel of the refrigerator, the smooth laminate of the cabinets, the metallic handle of the oven that had baked no real cake today. The room was perfect, a testament to the new order. It was also, in that moment, strangely hollow, a stage set for a play where the actress was replaced by a series of clever props. The day ended, not with a dramatic verdict, but with a weary acknowledgement. The world was changing, wrapping itself in cellophane and bright cardboard, speaking in the cheerful, imperative voice of progress. It was a world that asked me, with a smile and a box, to participate in my own obsolescence, to trade the tangible satisfaction of creation for the ambiguous freedom of convenience. It made me feel, in terms, slow for my lingering attachments, and cunning for my adoptions. It left me standing in my silent kitchen, competent yet uncertain, the architect of a spotless, well-managed life that sometimes felt like a beautifully packaged, slightly empty box itself. I turned off the overhead light, plunging the room into moonlight and shadow. The sentinels in the cabinets disappeared into the dark. The quiet propaganda of night was over, until the dawn would bring its next installment, gentle, persistent, and as inescapable as the new day itself.